I've been working, I think officially I'm now 42 years into the field. I got drafted in 1972. Instead of going to Vietnam, I went to Aberdeen Proving Ground and worked at the Human Engineering Lab, whose acronym was HELL. And that started my career. And eventually I kind of wound my way up to digital in the good days. I worked with a group that included Tom Spine and Michael Good, Sandy Jones, a bunch of folks, and things like contextual inquiry, usability engineering. We did inspections, I think, before anybody wrote about them at the time, so that was my early grounding. And in those early days, we started thinking about being very specific about what usability goals are. So we didn't talk about, oh, the product's got to be more usable. We wrote a spec for it. So I'm going to share some things. Now, I have to tell you, this is something I need to put out. My wife had open heart surgery. This is my third day out of the house. She's doing well. So if the phone rings, though, and I say, excuse me, I have to leave, forgive me, and I'll catch up with you again, okay? So I have a very wonderful wife. We met through an online dating service at Digital, and they used to promote dating inside of Digital, believe it or not. So, okay. So this is, I just kind of put together a little bit of history, and I do want you to know, those are from the CHI side of things. My wife and I did a husband and wife improv act about intellectual property, and I don't know anybody remember that. It was a long time ago, and I introduced sushi at that meeting, and it's the only meeting that I can recall, at least in my days, of that. So I also took John Carroll, who wrote about the minimalist manual and trading wheels interface that I'll mention tonight, and I drove him halfway to Portsmouth before I realized that wasn't Boston. So I have an interesting history with both STC and CHI here. The agenda for tonight, since for the last 2 months I've been taking care of my wife, and I should say I've learned a lot there. The most difficult thing that I had to learn was how to buy bras. I don't ever want to do that again. So there were some interesting things there. So I just kind of want to talk about learning. This is not a deep theoretical talk tonight. I kind of thought that wasn't a good fit for where I am right now. I'd like to talk a fair amount about learnability and what that is and how we can measure it. I've been in lots of companies, I've consulted, and I've taught lots of students, and people will talk about, boy, you got to make it easier to learn, or make it intuitive. Can somebody tell me what intuitive means? This is audience participation. Okay, what's intuitive mean? I still see that and read it. So just...
You don't have to think about it.
You don't have to think about it, so it's sort of a Steve Krugian thing, right? Okay, that's it. Anything else? Intuitive, go ahead.
Something that's obvious if you know how to use it.
Obvious if you know how to use it. Okay, I think others would disagree with that, but I think that's a good one. Anybody? Yes, way in the back. Okay, you don't have to use a manual, okay? So intuitive is kind of one of those things that's bugged me for years. I consider it a flaw in our field if you use that word, unless you define it, okay? So to me, intuitive means something like, I'm correct the first time, and it didn't take me an inordinate amount of time to figure it out, and I didn't have to read a manual. So some things there. The other thing is I realized in doing a little research for tonight that the show Downton Abbey, how many watch that? Okay, let's just check. How many don't watch it? Wow, okay, look like equal numbers watch it and don't watch it. Schrodinger's cat, okay. But there is a scandal regarding learning curves. Anybody know about that one? Okay, well, I'm going to expose the Downton Abbey scandal tonight. So I think, though it's sort of, there's some history behind this, but how can we evaluate usability and maybe some fresh ideas on that? And then there's maybe some principles. How much time do we have tonight?
About an hour.
About an hour?
8:30.
Okay, that's a good time because we get kicked out of here at 9, so yes, that's good. Okay, so, and then kind of just looking at some of the principles that support learning and sort of learnability and learning, and maybe make things less, less or more intuitive, okay? So that's kind of the night. I think I have 59 slides, so I have to go really fast. But we'll see. The slides probably have more than you ever wanted to know. So I also realized with the contrast here, there's some quotes. So there's some good stuff out there. It turns out Alfred North Whitehead and Steve Krug have something in common. It's kind of like civilization advances by extending the number of operations we can perform without thinking about them. Okay, that sounds like don't make me think, right? And I'll tell you, Ben Franklin was pretty good. He kind of considered different ways of learning. You can do kind of rote, you can work with it, or I can actually do something. So he has a good little quote. In this one, Aristotle he thinks that we have to endure great pain to learn. So learning is not child's play. You cannot learn without pain. So remember that, okay? So I think some of my students probably remember that from me as well. So a question. One of the things in thinking about learning and learnability is kind of elaborating on things. So I generated a giant list of kind of what is learning, and there are different kinds, of course. Some of you might have great depths of knowledge or be instructional designers, but I think we can go from rote memorization to making connections. Now, I think the second bullet is really kind of the essence of things. And there's another good book, Where Good Ideas Come From by Stephen Johnson. If you've read that, that's I think one of the best books, but it talks about that. Of course, there is conscious learning and unconscious learning. Tonight, I was faced with all these people whose faces look familiar, whose names I couldn't remember tonight. And there are things like face recognition, and it sort of goes on, and it's tacit. We can't really explain it too well. But I do know the day that I shaved my beard at 5 a.m. and then walked in and my wife woke up, saw this strange man in her house. There was some issues there as well. So just some things if you're sort of looking at acquisition of facts and skills, changing the brain. I mean, it's really, we're changing sort of the structure of our brain all the time, making connections weakening, and I think of it kind of like, when life started on Earth, there was sort of like all these chemicals kind of kept bouncing together for like millions of years, and I know there's research out there about sort of like, the constituents in lightning, but they keep hanging together until they make something new, and that's what happens a lot. There's the concept of elaborative encoding, and that's sort of instead of just kind of doing things, try to make new connections. So if you're looking at words, maybe use definitions, write them in sentences, try and use them. So, my wife and I have this game where we look up difficult words and we try to use them and figure out what they are. So that keeps us in great deals of love there. So, okay. So what is learning? There are lots of different approaches. And if you're looking at it, you need to think about supporting all of these. They're sort of like the learning that's going on all the time. There are different names for it: continuous, just in time, on demand. Empty vessel, pouring things into people. So that's kind of, that can provide some foundation, not necessarily bad, even though empty vessel sounds bad, pouring into one. Exploratory learning, reflective, divergent thinking. And then the last one's kind of interesting. Transfer appropriate. It's kind of a jargony term, but it means that you want to learn in the context that you would be kind of applying the learning, right? So if you're taking a test, you might study in the room that you would be taking the test in, okay? And it would be a more appropriate context to compare. So when I was a freshman, my background originally was physics, and I had a class in like this old building on the 3rd floor, I think it was. And so my way of studying was to go up and lecture to myself. So I'd walk up to the board and I'd lecture to myself, and then I'd go sit down and look at it and reflect on it. And it was the room where I'd be taking the exams, right? And then I wanted to understand this material. So I did this, and one day the security guard came up and he said, "Sir, you better come with me." and I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "You were talking to somebody, there's no one there, and you were lecturing or something like this." I said, no, I'm doing this kind of learning where I'm trying to do it in the same place. And and things. So, so I got called to the dean for lecturing to myself. And it was just, so anyway, there are a lot of different approaches. I'm not going to. I'm not a deep expert in anything, but sort of different approaches to learning, and you can mix and match these sometimes. You can fill the vessel, and you can reflect on things, and you can do it in the context that you would be doing it. But just a number of different approaches. Now, how many people know about learning styles? Is anybody a Myers-Briggs person? Okay, Myers-Briggs is a hot button. So say Myers-Briggs. Ah! Okay, it's a hot button. Anyway, so a couple of years ago, I was asked to research learning styles and could we apply them in some of our work. So doing design and architecture requires many different skills, reflection, creativity, putting things together. And I went out and so for those who know me, I have like 4,000, 5,000 books around my house. I'm giving them away now. So if you want some books, especially old books on UX, call me after the meeting here. But
them off next month.
pardon? Yes. Okay. You got a deal. So I looked at them and they were junk. I mean, they were like kind of theoretical, and they talked very general, no references, and all of them had a diagram, like their circle your diagram with their sort of thing. And then I started reading around and finding out that learning styles, there are things, like if you're going to be a boxer, you probably can't learn how to box by just watching a video, right? So it didn't work for me. But anyway, so I started digging around. It turns out, are there preferences for learning styles? The answer is yes. There are preferences. It can be kind of fun. But one of the thoughts is that learning is multimodal, and other than situations where you're doing something perhaps physical, where you need kinesthetic sort of learning, you can turn off the audio or you can turn off the video, and people will say this is my style and I do better at it, but on a lot of things they don't. So anyway, so I thought I'd bring up controversy tonight. You should all know I'm a card-carrying skeptic. Okay?
I don't.
Pardon?
I don't believe it.
Well, oh yes, I am a member of the Skeptic Society, yes. You don't believe that either, right? So anyway, just here are a couple examples of various tools and sort of digging in. So Myers-Briggs, actually it's kind of fun, but it isn't reliable if you dig into some of the good research on it. So, and I know this is one, my wife has a lot of fun with it, and we have a signal. If she wants to talk about the Myers-Briggs, she writes MB on a card, and I go in the TV room. So these are a couple. I thought something like the Gregoric style delineator, which deals with concrete, abstract, sequential, random. Those sound like kind of good things. Some things may be better learned sequentially, some things random. But it's questionable, as you might say. So there's a reference at the bottom. You can check in more details on that. I found this in numerous sources. If you want to look up a good, fair evaluation of the Myers-Briggs, there's a podcast called Skeptoid. Anybody familiar with Skeptoid? It's a skeptics thing, but it was kind of fair. And it said, if you treat this as fun, but as soon as you start making these things too important, it turns out for some of these things that in front of this group, if I go to a dance, I won't talk and I'll go over in the corner and I'll sweat. Okay? But in front of you guys, it's kind of fun to chat and talk and things. So the question is, there are preferences, yes. Do they matter? In many cases, they don't. So anyway, just I thought I might be kind of a skeptic tonight and cause some problems. Any question? Yes.
The last column,
Yes.
the labels that you gave each row, were those your determinations? Or
No.
someone
This
else's?
is a research article. They looked at many dozens of these. And what they did is they would do a study where they would ask people what their preferred style was, and then they do an experimental manipulation where they got rid of that style, and they had another group where they had people that included the style, and they found no differences. So in order to do this kind of study, it's fairly rigorous experimentally. So, but yeah, when they do this, you often find, it's like personality test. Personality tests generally account for a small amount of variance. Now, there's like the big five, introversion, extroversion, some others. They do a bit better, but it turns out the best way with a personality test is to look at the interaction with the situation. So there's an interaction, context with personality, and then, what's the measure, R squared, the variance that's accounted for, how much predictability gets higher. So there was a big debate in the 70s on personality tests. I don't think the Myers-Briggs was out then, but they looked at it and found it accounts for a very small percentage of variance because people are very situational. The way I am at a dance is not the way I am right now or the way I am in different situations. So if you want to scare me, invite me to a dance and you petrified, okay? So, but it's interesting how often learning styles come up. It sounds good. I mean, until I started looking at this literature and I actually threw these books out. They were all 5-star rated in Amazon. I got them and I was like, oh my goodness, there's no research, no support, no testing, and there's some general theory without any, validation. So, if anybody leaves here tonight feeling really hurt, call me, okay? But in terms of learnability and things, learning styles is, I don't give it much credit. Restart your computer, okay? Okay.
You're still equal now?
I think I've insulted somebody and, okay, postpone. Okay, so in thinking about learning, I think somebody in the back said something about don't read the manuals, and there are a lot of factors. This is a partial list here. In terms of learning and learnability, there's a certain investment. So at Autodesk, we sell a product called Revit. It's used to build lots of buildings, most new skyscrapers. The new skyscraper in China, that's the second tallest building in the world, they used our tool Revit. And so, it wasn't voluntary. You must use this. So people will invest days and weeks in different things. We have all kinds of things like video clips inside our things for different features, and there's some very progressive things, but things like that. So, and just generally how important, how much does it cost? You have other alternatives for a lot of apps. You're not going to spend a lot of time learning an app, I suspect, because there are many others that you could look at. So frequency of use is a real key, and I'll talk about that, but sort of how do you use something 1,000 times a day? And there's this trade-off between learnability and efficiency. And I think, and I'm gonna make a stake here, that we don't do enough sort of efficiency and sort of learnability over long periods of time. We do a think aloud usability test and find 10 problems about learning, and yeah, those might be important to sell it and for people to like it the first time, but what if you use something all the time, or you're using it, so our architecture tools, people will use their features thousands of times a day. Think of all the little details. Every one of these lights has to be positioned and moved around and things. So perceived usability, there's a whole bunch of research on aesthetics, and the perceived usability can intimidate people. Even if the testing shows it's empirically, just as good. So, those cluttered interfaces. So, and I'm thinking even the ego here. Sometimes I get really mad and I say, I'm going to learn this thing because, I think I should be able to learn it. So if we're thinking about investing in learning and such and how it interacts with the learnability of the system, some things to think about. And if you're designing your products and your various companies and consulting companies, you want to ask some of these questions about, how the product's going to be used. Now, some of these may be used, in some tools, you may have something like an audit function that one person or few people use once or twice a year. And then the other times you have really high frequency gurus operating on it. So you're going to have to build in sort of different types of learning support, if you will. But these are the kind of questions. Are there lots of apps that take pictures? Well, maybe so, and the one that takes the least time to learn will be the one. So, investment in learnability. I always like, this is my sort of elaboration on something. So, anybody a writer from digital in the old days? I think there are a couple in the room. Yes. Well, We were debating once, many years ago, about whether we use the word iconize or iconify. Which one was a word at the time? I may have changed by now. Anybody want to guess? Iconify? Iconize? Okay, how many say iconify? Okay, iconize. Okay, it turned out that iconize was the word, and iconify was not yet in the Oxford English Dictionary, so I took it into the room with a magnifying glass, and they were debating which one should we use in the interface, and I said, it is not iconify, that is not a word, it does not even exist. You know, Oxford English Dictionary, 1987 or so, 88. And anyway, they overrode me, went with iconize, or no, they went with iconify. I lost the battle. Anyway, I go to the OED to kind of look at the history of words. And if somebody asks you about usability, I think, I forget the details, but it goes back to like 1600s. And usability, the reference says something like, it's not the utility of the thing, it's the usability. It's very much the way we'd use it today. But anyway, here's Learnability, 1959, the quality or fact of being learnable. That's not too useful, right? So I kind of went, I said, okay, learnable. And here's a reference, the be mysteries, yet in some measure learnable, and then it, you know, but at least we know that 1630, we were talking about something like learnability there. So a little history on learnability. J.C.R. Licklider, anybody know him? His nickname was Lick? Yeah, he was this very cool guy who invented, actually he invented the general way of communicating, I think in 1973, even earlier than this one. He talked about stepwise learnability and how you can chunk things up so that people should be able to do certain things with interactive graphic systems. He was big into HCI, graphical interfaces. And I listened to a talk by his son. He died, I think, 1990. And his son said, well, my father was the kind of person, very humble, so he'd get an award and then he'd come up and he'd list 100 names off a card of the people who really deserve the credit. So, cool guy. But stepwise learnability, it felt very modern. It's in the CHI offerings. So you can look at that. So a little bit more about easy to learn by the, so then I started looking, what are the extended definitions? And most of them have something about easy to learn. Of course, they don't define that. Then they talk about class of users for whom it is interested. Then we go, let's go to Jacob, sort of, in his 1993 book, Usability Engineering, he says, easy to learn so that the user can rapidly start getting some work done with the system. And then in his website now, a quality attribute, and it is learnability is a bit of quality, if you will. In fact, one of the earlier places where I found absolute goals, literally absolute, quantitative goals, was in the quality assurance books around 1976. They would say, you know, the thing should take no longer than 1 hour to learn with no errors and no technical support calls. So, if you look at these, though, you start seeing a pattern. It's usually sort of talking about initial learning. You know, it doesn't talk about extended learning in these the first time. So the first time should be easy to learn. The user can rapidly start getting some work done with the system. So this is starting to highlight one of the key issues with our usability and learnability. We do a lot of initial stuff, and we know those things well, but we don't go far enough. And this has been my history. Have others, do others kind of run into that? We spend a lot of time, and we might iterate in an agile system and test things out, but we keep testing out the initial things with each version that we put out. And maybe with some things, I know, Greg, you're here from MathWorks, right? You guys have a complex product. We have a complex product. And there are very complicated problems once you get past the initial things. And if you start reading like diaries and you start looking at, you know, tech support lines, you kind of get that sense. So an issue with learnability is we focus on that beginning. We don't go further for things where we go further. So, so this is learnability. Maybe many of you are familiar. So this is sort of a basic thing. It's so I put it, but notice learnability and efficiency are related, right? If you're slower getting into it, you're going to take more time. So kind of relates. Memorability, I think, is a subset, if you will, of learnability. Can you remember something from one time to another? So I'm thinking that I once had an intern who had to fill out one of those weekly time card systems. Anybody familiar with those? Yeah, kind of. Every week I had to spend like 25 minutes figuring it out and helping him as I was his manager, and things. So error rates, things are related, satisfaction's related to learnability. So anyway, there are lots more things. And on the side, we're going to not talk about delight and pleasure and fun tonight, but that's what's over there under UX and more ... Okay? So, okay. So some history there. So this is in 1997. Maybe some of you were there. They talked about power usability, and what they said is that we kind of get over these things, but we need to sort of extend out. We have to think about learning curves, not just kind of like a learning point. So we might want to repeat a task or do something over and over. Frequency of use for many things is one of the most important things you can ask and understand in the distribution of the frequency of use in here. So there are things like what happens on April 15th? Taxes. Okay, so you think about that, you do it once a year and you walk through that wizard, right? Okay, wizard, most people don't complain unless you're a professional. If you were a professional, you wouldn't want to be walking that wizard, would you? So you kind of get into designing two different ways and providing, some of the things I think provide a form and a wizard and variations on that. So frequency of use, very, very important thing, and there are other things too. So there's frequency of use, even what time people use things, are they fatigued, lots of stuff there. So we should, power usability, learnability over extended periods is something we need to consider, okay? So there's some other concepts that come around it that, and these are kind of good things to think about in doing field interviews and such, but predictability, consistency. I wrote a paper on consistency, I don't know, in Interactions, the CHI magazine a while back, and just kind of talked about, it's not, you know, sometimes people think visual consistency and stuff, but it's very important with respect to learnability, right? So if you go through your system and it's variable, in one place it does it this way and this way, and I've looked at products where they, you know, there was one product, and I showed it in my class, I think, once, but pretty much it had 12 ways to do the same thing. Kind of scary, things like that. So some categories, I'll leave these with you, but there's a lot of work in discoverability. Can the person find the icon for remove wall? Okay? Yeah, but once they find it, or after a few times, they'll find it again. So discoverability is a little bit overrated unless it's something you use once a year, once a month, once a week maybe. So some of the things that affect learnability and good things to consider. Okay, how are we doing for time? We're doing okay.
Yeah.
8:15.
8:15, thanks. So here, just a picture of Licklider and a couple references. Do you guys post the slides for things?
You can if you want.
Yeah, okay. So just a few notes, but this goes into his kind of description about learnability and increments of information and being able to get into some real work. This guy was really kind of a cool guy. You know, it's the kind of guy I wish I'd met at some point. But okay, now, one of the best papers, and this could have been a Chi Bits, I guess, I didn't think about it, was conducted by the Autodesk Research Group. They put a paper in 2009 that looked at learnability. And it talked about, which is a little bit the focus of my talk tonight, but that there are lots of definitions, and when they went through, they find all kinds of them. So in thinking about how do you determine what learnable is, how do you set goals, they came up, they took the research and kind of coded it and came up with a couple different factors, and these might sound somewhat familiar. So learnability is based on the ability to, and then they look at perform well, improve performance, and eventually achieve a score or something. So you can start looking at categories out here during an initial task, during an initial interval. So maybe you can complete the task, or maybe you have to complete the task within an hour. Okay, so different little different things. over intervals, specific performance, optimal performance. So optimal performance may be where the performance goes asymptotic on your learning curve. And then you talk about, you need to understand the user and bring the user into it. So if you have personas and you have an idea what kind of metrics are important, then you can start developing your learnability goal. So, so we have learnability is the ability to do, and then sort of metrics for a user who's computer experience, UI experience, domain, and experience with similar software. There might be other categories there, but think about, let's think about somebody who has a Mac and a PC, and they just get a little confused about things sometimes, and you're shifting. So I shift back and forth. I have 4 Macs and 3 PCs and a couple desktops. Not that I'm a nerd, okay? So this little algorithm might be something you'll find useful. So the paper, if you look up Autodesk Learnability 2009 in the CHI proceedings, you can get some really good detail. And I thought this would be the key paper for the talk. Okay, any questions? Okay, I should note that if there are any cookies left after this, my pay is docked, so make sure all the cookies are gone if they aren't already. Okay? Okay, no questions? Okay, so how do we characterize it? Okay. There we go. Okay, so characterize it. So now we get into learning curves. So how many people ask your development product design teams to draw the learning curves for the product that you're working on? Okay, I'm assuming that all hands down means everybody doesn't. I think this should be one of the keys, and I'll just state it out front. Have your team get around and say, and we'll talk about learning curves just a little. I mean, it's kind of interesting in looking at learning curves. Did I hear a beep? Did I beep? Oh, okay, sorry. So if I hear beeps every once in a while, so when my wife was recovering from her open heart surgery, she couldn't get out of bed on her own at night. And we decided the best way to alert me, think Pavlov, was to ding this bell that you might find at an old-fashioned hotel. Ding, 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 ding. And then I would go help her out and kind of give her an assist on that. So if I start hearing bells, forgive me, but that's why, okay? I was reading about Pavlov, and I thought, oh, okay. In fact, a couple nights I woke up hearing bells. So anyway, I think a really good exercise is to draw the hypothesized or the learning curve that you think would match your product. If it's an ATM, okay, what would you want? You'd want an initial very high, like maybe 70%, okay? 70% success as a starting, maybe 80 or 90, because people are going to walk up and use your system, okay? So there's a method, the cognitive walkthrough, and if you look at some of the articles about that, the cognitive walkthrough is for walk up and use systems like ATMs or kiosks or touchscreens of different sorts. So when I see you guys again at the party, I'm going to ask all of you, did you do a learning curve since you were at Autodesk? Okay, so be prepared. Okay, but it's kind of cool. You might have some people think they should be able to use this, within a few hours. And what kind of, we'll look at a couple of examples. And it might be that if it's something you use intermittently that you want it pretty high, but it'll dip, and then you want people to relearn quickly, right? It's memorable. So here we get into memorability. So just a little history here. Hermann Ebbinghaus wanted to show that you could study cognitive processes in an experimental way. So he's the one that had like a couple thousand, 2,300, I think, of these words up here like Deb, Dick, and Waft. Okay, so he took these nonsense syllables so they were not so connected with words we actually know and can identify easily. And he kind of drew learning curves where he'd learn these things and then he'd wait a day and then he'd wait 2 days and 3 days. So now he didn't call it the learning curve. Ebbinghaus called it the forgetting curve and such. But he was describing in effect what we now call the learning curve. So the term itself started to be used around 1909. It came into sort of use with psychologists on a very limited basis in the 10s, 20s, and 30s, somewhere in it didn't become a word that all of us so frequently use until like the 70s. And then it turned out management groups kept talking about steep learning curve. Steep learning curve, it's bad, it's hard. What does steep learning curve mean to you?
They can learn very fast.
Yes, you're right, exactly. So it turns out that the sort of informal use that we make, actually, I'm in meetings where people say, that's got a steep learning curve. Oh, that's bad. No, steep. So it could be steep, positive or negative, depending on whether you're looking at task time or some kind of productivity score. So some of the early things were done on like manufacturing systems, and they looked at productivity, so it would start low and it would go up. Time would start high and go down. So there are really two different ways of looking at learning curves. The Downton Abbey curve schedule, there's the phrase that nearly knocked it off television. I've been on a steep learning curve since arriving at Downton. That was 1920, and the series is, I think 1920, give or take a year. It was not in use by British royalty until like 70s. Anyway, so if you want to have some fun, there's an anachronism site for Downton Abbey, and I think somebody reported a modern Coke bottle in the background. Probably somebody doing the props and stuff got in trouble for that. So anyway, so a little background on learning curves. I've started doing this routinely in meetings, and it's kind of interesting. Just ask people to sketch out and say at the bottom, it can be a number of trials, but I want some sense of time. So if it's 5 trials in a day and then 5 more and 5 more, kind of just describe that and then draw what you would like. And some people use a scale of minutes, some hours, some days. Okay, so it reveals some hidden assumptions about learnability and learning of the particular feature or product or service that you're going to work on. So I think this is kind of a small technique, and I find it very powerful. So yes, you'll be quizzed next time we meet. Okay. So just a couple simple examples. If you go out you can go out and you can search on Google and get lots of different things. You can compare products, and you might see that over time, products go down. Some might start higher. If we looked at the beginning, we might consider products, maybe the first shot initial is low, but then people get more efficient. So here's kind of a quick example, and here's another one. This is looking at a score productivity. So you might get people an exam, repeated math exam or something, and see how they do over time and with practice. So I think this is a good way to understand how people think about your product. Now, a number of years ago, I don't know if I worked with anybody here, there, now, but I worked at Dun & Bradstreet Software. It was a $500 million booming mainframe, moving to Windows system, and one of the things that happened while I was there is that we bought what probably now be called a service, and they advertised, immediate learning. You're effective within a day. And then they sold it to us, and they said, "Oh, you must all take 5 days worth of training at a minimum." And I actually brought up when I went to the training, I took the ad, and the people said, "Oh, those old damn marketing people, they should just tell people without 5 days of training you can't use." So their learning curve was, like 1 day optimal performance versus it turned out it was like 5 days of training and then 5 months of work. So anyway. I wasn't popular in that one. Okay, so how do we evaluate it? So there are some traditional ways, a few ideas. There are ways, evaluation might be a strong word. I'm often thinking quantitatively, but it might be something subjective. So for example, how many people use the SUS scale? System Usability Scale, I think a bunch of you. So there's a subscale in there that I think I haven't listed, but you can get a learnability score on that, a rating, and if you will. So we'll look at a few ways of evaluating in here. So you should all know there is an international standard. So I decided that I had to read the detail and not a third-party account of this, so I bought the standard. 118 Swiss francs. Okay, so then I had to go get a calculator and find out that's $125. Anyway, so I'm not supposed to copy it because it has a thing on it like your name is on there, do not copy, we'll arrest you, sort of thing. So, but if anybody wants to borrow it for a day without making copies, let me know and such, but it was kind of interesting. So it talks about learnability, so it breaks it down into kind of some basic categories. Effectiveness, how many functions, features, things did you learn about the product? How many people learned to some criterion, so some examples. It talks about efficiency, time to learn to a particular criterion, which might be a particular score, it might be a particular time, if you will. And then various rating scales, and there are a number of learning scales if you dig around in that. It does also talk about some of the things you need to know about users. So I talked about this a bit earlier, but what domain knowledge, experience with systems, with the OS, with similar software, with target software. So if you're looking at learnability, all these things are probably good to screen for and get a sense of it. And I think it's kind of interesting now with so many apps and sort of, there are some good patterns out there for some of these, but there's some sort of interesting things about, I haven't done a lot of learning studies on many apps yet, so some interesting things there. Okay, so how can we measure it? So initial learnability, classic method is benchmarking, came out of usability engineering, which sort of was the dominant, so there was usability engineering and then we hit discount usability. What is it now? Super discount or? Agile. Agile, but Agile probably uses discount methods and iterative design. So these things go well together, but so benchmarking and this would be without a lot of interference, without engaging the user. So there's another approach. This is described in the 2009 article on learnability from our Autodesk researchers. But we have this technique we call sort of thinking aloud, right? And what's the rule for that? You don't chatter a lot, right? So, and you try to be neutral observer. So there's an interesting approach, and this actually goes by some other names. I think some instructional designers and people looking to get deep domain knowledge during interviews, and I forget the name of the people who do that, but so this is one where when people are struggling, you say, ask me for help. And then you provide sort of gradated help. You provide a little bit of help. So you might say, go to the upper right, and then you say, go try this, and then click on this menu. And you kind of see where they're getting. So it's a more active approach. And knowledge acquisition. This was a place, sort of people looking at knowledge acquisition would use this kind of approach, similar approach to this. We have cognitive walkthroughs. How many have done cognitive walkthroughs in here? Okay, so the traditional method that was so difficult that the PhD psychologist struggled with it. Okay, use the streamline method. Okay, just curious. Okay, so it's getting dark. It's hard to see faces now. So forums, satisfaction surveys. Now extended usability. I know some of my colleagues from Autodesk recently worked on a diary study. We had a tool called D-Scout. Anybody use that? Sort of the app where you can sort of put information, snap pictures, type things in. Worked reasonably well and stuff, but we want to look at extended learnability. How do things sort of go over time? Where do people get stuck later? So this gets beyond. We have satisfaction surveys looking at experienced users. We do one for our product Revit. We had 1,400 respondents last time. We had several hundred comments on learnability, and we know how long these people have used the product. And sometimes they'll describe, this is a repeated experience. I can't learn how to do this very easily. Or we get sort of kudos. This was really easy to learn, discoverable. Oh, okay. Okay. I'm glad it didn't come up and say something like really embarrassing. Okay. So So a range of methods. There's another one it's in press, and this is the reference, and I just kind of, in looking through methods, it's a retrospective method where you ask people to kind of describe, sort of like a journey map, where you're rating positive and negative experiences, but it's sort of a small version of looking at long-term experience and having people jot out memorable sort of incidents, and they call it the UX curve. So they're again sort of drawing out incidents and assigning a negative or positive weight to that. But one of the things I think we need to do as a field more, and it goes back at least 97, they're worried about power usability. We are not treating sort of our power users well and looking at learnability. So anyway, some references for you. The Learnability Metrics, this comes from 3 or 4 sources, but you can look. There are lots of task metrics, mental metrics, think time. There's also sort of research in the cognitive literature about after a while you can sort of deal with larger chunks of information. I remember that from a cognitive psych course somewhere. Features, subjective metrics, user assistance. How many times do they have to go try things out? So these are all measures. You could do a spec and pull 2 or 3 of these measures. Oh, spec's a dirty word. Oh, okay. But you can kind of think about these as ways to look at the data. There's an interesting one at the end, and I did some work years and years ago where we wanted to look at how learnable the system was to have something predictive. So we kind of elaborated all the rules that you needed to understand the particular system. And sometimes something very simple had lots of rules and sort of hidden rules and stuff. And it's also a measure of complexity, if you will, but it was a measure of usability. And the last one, I'll have a couple examples in there, but we're looking at very specific goals. So here's a Learnability Spec. I said the dirty word. So now here's something I'm going to say that might be sort of kind of weird sounding. I think that this kind of describing what learnability means or usability or whatever metrics you're looking at, just thinking about this gives people a better sense of what they're designing for and what expectations are. So the first one, initial performance, there's a particular task. I'm going to look at the mean time overall. Does the group get there? I have a current version, so maybe I did a small test to get some sense of that. There's a plan level. I want the plan level to be 20% smaller than the current version. We're looking at time. Best case would be 50% faster, and the now level is what I have with this current version. And then I have a sus example here, what I'd want for scores. So even thinking about what this means and how long it takes to do something is a useful exercise, even if you never test it. So it gets out assumptions that people have about difficulty and task and learnability. So this came out of the work starting around 1985, and it's sort of got a little bit hidden, but this kind of, sometimes you can just go around a room and have people write down on a card some assumptions. There's a technique called brain writing, and you can ask them questions. So you might ask a question, how long do you think it should take for somebody to learn this so they don't make any errors? And you'll get 30 seconds, 3 days, 5 weeks, get good information again. So, okay, I'm going to go a few more minutes, I think, and that gets us pretty close to time. So there are other questions too. How do we get people to motivate? And I kind of gave up on the classical conditioning for this, and it looked like operant learning. I dug back. I had a course from one of B.F. Skinner's students, and I found this old manual of programmed learning, and I couldn't find it. I was going to bring it and pass it around, but it had programmed learning about psychology. The professor's name was Holland, if anybody has that book, and such. But I thought, a lot of these things are being used in gamification, which is kind of good. Some of these things might be very useful, but there's also sort of some interesting research on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and that's probably too much for tonight. So let's see. So I have some examples. Leaderboards. I have discovered that some of these things aren't real popular. I did a little bit of work in gamifying. Not everybody wants to be seen on a leaderboard, or maybe not being the leader. So, and I think they have the thumbs up. Do you notice some things have no thumbs down? So I found a case study someplace, and I think it was one of the restaurant stores. They said, well, when we started out, we didn't have many people, so we did thumbs up. So and then later they thumbs down, and then later they added scales. I don't know if it was Yelp or, one of them. But so just a few examples in here. So I think so some of these work well. Kudos. Khan Academy is kind of interesting. How many people have tried it? So I actually decided once I wanted to cover all of their math. So I started out with first grade addition, and then I worked my way up to second semester calculus or something. But it had some interesting ones like earn nice listener. I didn't know what to make of that. Nice listener. So now one of my hobbies is astronomy and cosmology, and it actually has some very good little segments on things like the radius of the observable universe. So for those who are interested, they're now estimating 93 billion light years, something like that. Anyway, so I found some of these laughable after a while, and I do find their instruction entertaining, and I've had fun with it. But anyway, so some examples: healthy shopping. Trying to support my wife, I've been trying to do really healthy foods. So this kind of cart would be really good, except mine would be dark green. So we're giving up on things, but some things there. Okay, a couple of notes. I'm thinking one of the things I enjoy most is kind of trying to be creative. So I wrote a little book on brainstorming and sort of try a lot of ideas out and things. So good ideas are these things connecting together. I mean, they're making associations and connections. And I have a few notes here, and I think I'll end on that. So the book I would recommend that I found most interesting and useful, and I'd take pieces and then I'd elaborate on them, on some of the things, is Stephen Johnson's book, Where Good Ideas Come From. Great stories, but he also goes into things like, the adjacent's possible, so we can go so far. So if you remember the story of Babbage and his computer, Lady Lovelace, it's a pretty good story, and she was very strange, and he was very strange. Yes, they were, but they built this wonderful calculating machine, the small one, I believe. They never finished the big one, and one of the things though that they didn't quite have the technology to go that next step. So they talked about adjacent's possible. So here's like new technology, and here's really advanced, and then there's something maybe far out there. And kind of like going from one room to another, that's a good way to come up with ideas. So there's some really cool ideas there, and such. Yes? Oh, yeah.
Why does it say issue suggestion box?
Oh, suggestion boxes don't work. So, pardon?
Who says?
Well, there's several things where they might work. And I'm talking about metaphorically. This could be a virtual or a physical one, but mostly they go in there and nobody trusts them. So you put something in a box. Now, if you had a good company that reported on those and what they did, then I would say that's probably good. But the ideas are static. They're not dynamic. They're not affecting the world. If you put them on a poster in a hallway where people walk by every day, that would probably be better. Okay? So it's kind of like you need to bounce ideas together. I mean, we sort of, you probably all read, heard, seen videos on the DNA, the discovery of the double helix, right? There was a triple helix. That was the bad one. Yeah, the double helix. And it turns out that they had spent years working in their respective fields, and then they stole Rosalind her X-ray crystallography, and but their ideas, it took like 20 years for these ideas to germinate and bounce around and things. So there's also, I don't think I had it here, but he talks about liquid networks. So letting ideas bounce around. So before we moved into this building, we did a little exercise where we wanted to get us ideas from people and have them manipulate things. So we got magnetic boards, and we put them on the aisle where everybody walked by, and we said, redo the menus. And people would walk up, and developers walked up, and then they got in little groups. The ideas were being bounced together, and we had a representation there. So that would be better than having a box that put your menu ideas on a card and put them in the box. So, anyway, that's it, folks. Thanks. So, if anybody's interested, I have a huge bibliography on like creativity and sort of a lot of ideas. That was a couple of years ago, we were talking about sort of innovation, and there's some actually books that aren't pretty that are really good. So if anybody's interested in innovation and creativity, this was a good starting point, and I have some other stuff too. So any questions, comments?
Lights on so you can see.
Pardon?
You want to turn the lights on so you can see?
Okay, the knees are stiff, it's gonna take a minute, okay. Okay, if anybody had your eyes closed, get them open quick so nobody sees. Okay, okay.
When you said you asked the staff about learnability curves and asking them to produce them, are they
Yep.
working towards what they think it will be or what the target is?
So sometimes I think it's important to understand the assumptions of the stakeholders
Right.
and get a sense of that. And I gave a couple examples on the board just to kind of lay out what I wanted. Gave them a big note card, and said put down, you kind of a rough interval and what it would be like. And sometimes people's expectations would be so far off from data I had, with talking to users, was kind of frightening. I do a similar exercise sometimes where I might go in and ask development groups or development teams, or maybe I'll split it up and ask them, I'm going out in the field, what 3 questions would you like me to ask? And I find out the developers say, what color would they like on the, drop-down list? And the UX folks say this, and the marketing folks want this. So it's sometimes a good exercise to have these little tiny things that take 2 or 3 minutes at the end of a meeting or something, and you can say, we want to understand better what your assumptions are about what we're doing. If you do it really early, you can even use that to help kind of change some things and make people aware of it. Yeah, but I think one of the big things is we sometimes have hidden assumptions, and this was a way to kind of get that out. How long should it take for this product to be learnable by the particular classes of users that we have, or personas? Yeah. Yep. Yes, over there.
Has anybody ever measured it? It doesn't sound like anybody, and I can believe it, working for corporations, has really tried to measure learnability by repeatedly testing the same people, let's say, over and over to see if there was improvement or improves over a couple of weeks.
So I did it once in 1986. Seriously, we brought people in for like 6 days, and we're testing like Microsoft Project, except it was on fax computers then. And we tracked their usage, and at the end of each day, we had them run through a set of similar, the tasks were pretty much identical, except we changed the data, so we try to keep them consistent. But I think for some tools, that could be a great thing to do. And with diary studies or logging, we have logging data now, so maybe we could do some of these things. So, but I think that kind of testing over time to see what the curve is like is pretty rare. I don't think it's that difficult either.
It's expensive. We would test within tests. So if we had like 7 tasks, we could tell by the end of, let's say, an hour session, how long it took them to learn overall navigation.
Yeah.
That we would see. But of course, individual tasks we couldn't, because we're only testing it once. Each
Right,
time.
now, I've done that where I've kind of spaced it out. If there were 10 tasks, 3 or 4 were the same. I mean, with small variations, but mostly there would just be the numbers would be a little different. So, yeah.
And that's encouraging. If people can't learn it within your hour and a half, that's bad.
Yeah, now, on a lot of simple products, that may be sufficient. So initial usability may get, we talk about the magic number of 5 and things. Well, if you come to the session Friday, we're gonna debate that. I'm gonna lay that one to rest. You know, it's 5 people for each user group iterated many times throughout a project. So, but I think we can do that, and it, you know, if you're doing something like we use where people, their lives, their productive lives depend on our product. So it isn't every product, but for ours, extended learning, Adobe, those of you, how many people spend hours with drawing tools, Adobe and something? So, you know, think about a bit, I know with Adobe, I use it a fair amount, but I still forget. I have to relearn things over and over again. So now, oh yes, I slapped my head. So, question, yes?
I worked for a company that had products only sold in North America for many, many years. Then we decided to go global. And I have a really hard time identifying what our users are like in other parts of the world. Have you ever dealt with something globally? Did it affect your approach?
Well, it's, so I have done some global studies. Right now, though, we have groups in China, we have groups here, we have groups in Romania and Krakow, and we are doing remote studies and we are collecting demographic data from all the studies, and we discovered that the standards for engineering are different in Europe than they are here, and that affects some things.
Yeah.
So I guess through even satisfaction data, we collect it twice a year, and we're developing large samples across 15 to 20 countries. So we are trying to gather that, and then we can analyze the other, you know, we have an open-ended question. Now, some people may argue that people don't want to fill out open-ended questions. Well, for products where it's important, we have like 60% of our users in SAT surveys give us a lot of feedback. In fact, some people have given us so much feedback that the database crashed, which meant it was more than 5,000 characters. That's open-ended data, but this is so important to people. So it depends. The importance variable might affect that some. So yes. So, but it is hard. I mean, getting it. China's a different market. We're still learning, but I've gone to China twice and done some work there. So yeah. Questions? Yes.
What types of changes do you typically try to make if you find you're not meeting your learnability goals?
Oh, well then I might use a technique called impact analysis and see. So let's say I do run a group of people or I do some kind of larger study. I would say, are they encountering a particular problem? And then I say 5 out of 6 people encountered this. And we're talking maybe initial at this point, but I would look at the thing that occurred most frequently or had the most impact or wasted the most time. And then I'd redesign it and maybe do quick test. And then, you know, if you're doing agile or iterative testing, you could look at that in the future. Yeah. So the old technique, we used to videotape and like how many seconds did people spend in errors. So we talked about time spent in errors, and then we take the most time is where we start redesigning, and then we do quick little tests. We grab people, so we would do some work like that as well. But I mean, a general thing of where's the most impact, the most frequent thing? Does it happen at this particular point? You know, is there a navigational point where it hits? So I can send you some ideas there for that. Yeah. Okay. Yes, Ron.
It would seem that there's a difficulty in describing, from your presentation, describing learnability, measuring it, and the fact that most people don't specify a learning curve for a product, right?
But it's so easy. You can do it. You can do it tomorrow. Well, you can ask. Well,
I'm gonna suggest maybe even another level of simplification and see if it works. I don't know. Because the components of learnability, and I think if I can remember some of them, errors, memorability, efficiency, some of those things, if you simply called it effort, and you looked at effort to benefit curves, I wonder if people could latch onto that more easily and describe it, and you could just, if something takes a lot of effort.
I've seen curves like that, so I mean, that sounds familiar.
If it takes a lot of effort, then, and you're not seeing the benefit, and you have some expectation, whether it's an ATM or a CAD/CAM software program, you have some level of expectation. And as soon as I've seen users, as soon as they start eroding on I'm putting too much work into this. I made a mistake and I can't figure it out. It's feeling hard. I can't remember it, it feels difficult.
The answer is, that sounds pretty reasonable, yep. I think, yep. I can't debate you, it sounds like a reasonable idea to try, yep. Come Friday though, we'll debate. Okay? Anybody else? Anybody want to go home? Okay. Okay, everybody, thanks.